Hey guys, I'm back in the shop working on the Jeep buggy, getting ready for s'more, and I banged away at a bunch of little projects along the way. Redid a fuel line, redid some tool storage. I'm working on getting a power tank mounted today. Just odds and ends maintenance stuff. Worked on the transmission on jack stands now. I got it in 3 gears. I have not taken this thing for a hot lap yet, but I wanted to go over one of the big concerns with off-roading and rolling over a vehicle. So one of the biggest things in a rollover outside of safety, right, is getting the vehicle back upright, getting oil out of cylinders, oil out of intake manifolds, and getting the thing to fire back up. There's a lot of, I think, misunderstood reasons of why oil gets to the top side of the pistons in a rollover. I think a lot of people think it's because oil is getting past the piston and ring set in the motor while the thing's upside down. I'm just going to argue that and say that that's not the reason that oil gets to the top side of the pistons. Anybody that's built a motor, and especially some old froze up, chunk of iron out of a junkyard, you pour oil into them top side of the cylinders to try and get the rings to break free and stuff like that. And that oil will sit on top of that for days and won't get past the rings. You get water ingested in a motor. Pull something out of the bottom of the lake, which I did a lot when I was in the boat business. And, that motor will sit there hydraulic for days, again, weeks, if you don't, pull plugs and get the water out. Well, if the water's just sitting on top of the piston and it can get past the rings that easily, that quick, you'd think that motor would unhydraulic itself, but it doesn't. So I think when this thing's upside down, there's not a chance for oil to get past the rings and end up hydraulic in a motor. So I'm going to say 99% of these hydraulic motors with oil on the top side of the pistons, it's coming through the intake tract. And I'll show you here what I mean by that. All right. So now this is classic Chevy small block, still carbureted. And whether this is an EFI, carbureted, throttle body, multi-port, straight 6, 4-cylinder, an engine's an engine, it's an air pump, right? You have an EVAP, or excuse me, not an EVAP system. You have a PCV system in 99%, 100% of modern vehicles that come from the factory. So PCV system, positive crankcase ventilation. So your valve cover here, one side or the other, or both sides, or sometimes it's in the intake manifold. If it's a valley style, it comes from the engine block somewhere, things of that nature. And that goes either directly into manifold vacuum, which would be below the throttle plates in a throttle body application, or it's going to come in at your air cleaner above the throttle plates. I'm not a modern expert when it comes to positive crankcase ventilation systems, PVCs, but I do know that most of the time it's fed into a port below the throttle plates, so it's constantly pulling a vacuum on the engine, keeping, that helps with ring seal, helps with emissions, because any blow by, any compression getting past the rings, getting into the crankcase, gets vented back up through, a hose routing system coming in and sucking it back into the combustion chamber, burning things off. So we'll take classic small block Chevy, which I know a lot of your straight 6s, 4-bangers, V6s, etc. They all have breathers of some sort or a PCV valve in the top of the valve cover. So that just plugs into a little hole, just like these guys do. And then that gets routed right back into the intake tract. So if this engine goes over on its side, the oil from the oil pan, that's sitting in a level in there. And then as that engine goes to 90 degrees, the engine oil level goes to 90 degrees as well. So that oil level now is, rather than the oil being in the bottom of the pan, the oil is all up in like this valve cover right here. It's in the bottom side of the pistons, in the cylinder bores on the underside of the compression side of the piston, but this valve cover is full. So as this valve cover fills with oil, this is most likely still now going to be the lowest point. It's going to start draining out of this crankcase vent. And as it's draining out of this crankcase vent, it's going to start filling a hose, which this hose then is running over to your intake track. So it's literally the oil's seeking a level, and it's one, it's trying to get out. Two, it's creating a new oil pan per se, which is your valve cover, and then it's also pumping, up the hose and into the breather system. So, or recirc system, whatever you want to call it. So as this is on its side, this fills up and starts pouring oil down into the intake track, or it sits above the throttle plates, depending on how your PCV system is set up. And then when you roll this thing back upright, now all that oil is again trying to go to the bottom. So the valve cover, it drains back into the crankcase. You let the thing sit and let the oil, just like pouring oil down, filling it, takes a few seconds for that oil to get to the bottom, pull your dipstick, check your level. But whatever was in this hose here and whatever is in the intake track is now above the pistons. And as soon as you crank this thing, it's going to open whatever valves have oil behind them, set it in on top of the piston, and hydraulic it. So that's how modern vehicles are set up. You go to the racetrack, they just have exposed breathers, things like that, so that they can just vent to atmosphere. They don't want that crankcase contamination coming into their intake track, on a drag card to affect a tune-up or something along those lines. So that's how I had this. All right, I just had some cheap breathers. It was made just like this, except it didn't have the nipple on it to fit a hose, and it just had holes punched in the bottom. So I was making a mess out of my valve covers, things of that nature, as this thing was, that air coming out of the crankcase has also got oil vapors with it, so it just makes a mess. So and then I started thinking about it. I'm like, well, if I flop this thing up on its side, those original breathers, they're just going to be like just drain plugs, more or less, and oil's going to just start pouring out of them. And this thing holds 8 quarts of oil in the crankcase, so I'm going to be chasing, one, cleanup of 8 quarts of oil, depending on how long it lays on its side, and 2, trying to find 8 quarts of oil trail side, because I'm not carrying 8 quarts of engine oil with me. So what I'm going to end up doing here is I put these Mr. Gasket breathers in with a 5/8 barb, and I got some 5/8 PCV hose, which is like the biggest hose I could find for this, and I ran it up, and I'm going to cross the engine with it. So by crossing the engine, if it ends up on the passenger side, this passenger breather is going to be up on the driver's side and high. So it'll be right here. So then if I flop it to the driver's side, that guy there is now going to be the lowest point, and it's going to breathe out that guy over there. I've got some little filters to keep the mud daubers and the dirt and the dust, because this, there is a little foam filter in here to start dropping the oil out of the airstream or airflow. But I'm gonna, these are gonna get dirt and debris sucked in and out, because as those pistons go up and down, it'll have pressure one moment and a little bit of a vacuum the next, especially on say a 4-cylinder. There's a lot of in and out movement. 8-cylinder, a little bit less in and out airflow down those hoses. So now if I flip this thing completely upside down, we are still going to be draining oil out of these guys. But this is just kind of a mock-up test here for when we go to s'more. If I go upside down, oil's coming out. Oil was coming out anyhow. What I might look into doing is, ultimately, if this works, maybe an aftermarket catch can somewhere in here. A catch can is, again, a vapor separator of sorts. So as the oil is coming with the air up these hoses and ultimately blowing out this little filter that's going to be on here, the air's coming out, oil's coming with it. Catch can gives a second for that moisture to drop out of it, similar to like an air filter on, or a water separating filter on an air compressor. So if that works, do a catch can. I could maybe do 2 catch cans if I need to, 1 on each side. Or if I roll this over and everything works, I could maybe look at a catch can in the center. But the closer I get to the center of the engine, the closer I will be to the oil level of the new oil level as the engine's on its side. So I'm a little concerned about that, not sure what I'm going to do. But the other thought is, and I'm going to have to research this a bunch, is if I do the ultimate catch can thing, this guy here on my fuel system, this is an anti-rollover, or well, they call it a rollover valve, but you can hear inside it, there's a little ball. So this is for my fuel vent. So when the Jeep goes on its side or upside down, it won't be pouring fuel out of it. This is mandatory at a lot of circle tracks. I don't know if it's a drag racer thing or not, but this little guy, again, when it goes upside down, it blocks fuel flow. Yet when it's right side up, it can vent and allow, the fuel tank to go dry while I'm sucking fuel out of the bottom of it. So that's kind of an abomination that I created there. But I don't know if I can get a giant one with like the flow ratings that could be moving in and out of this thing. It does have a lot of blow by. Piston ring seal is not great. But so more or less what I'm going to end up saying is, if you are off-roading, you should probably look, and you're off-roading to the level that you're going to be rolling one of these things over. You should look into modifying your PCV system. So by modifying that PCV system, when you flop this thing on its side, you might lose oil out of your modified PCV system, but you're going to keep it from ending up on top of the intake track, getting the first key bump, and the thing dumps a bunch of oil into 1 or 2 cylinders. That piston comes up, it can't go, it bends a rod, breaks piston, things like that. I know, just watching other YouTubers, the Hemis are really bad for it. Seems like maybe the V6 Jeep motors are bad for it. I hear like the Toyota 22R guys are like, nah, that thing will run on its side upside down. That's an old engine design that most likely has like a completely different old school crankcase vent system, or they've been modified so that thing can run upside down and not start forking oil down the intake track. So even if it's something you modify for off-road and then legally you put it back to EPA standards, pull some hoses, put some little vents in, cap some ports, things like that. Otherwise, just know that when you start cranking that thing over, you got to have the plugs. I know, like the Hemis, I know a guy that grenaded a Hemi, pulled the spark plugs, cranked the thing over, nothing seemed wrong with it, put plugs back in it, twisted the key, and that thing just sent the rods out the side. So there was oil in that intake track, and the engine fired. He blipped the throttle, and that oil puddle that was in the intake got sucked into the motor and killed the cylinder. So that's food for thought. If I'm doing something completely wrong, please let me know. If you got a better idea of what you've done, please share a link to another video. And if you like what you saw today, like, subscribe, share it with your friends, and we'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.